Okay, in the last video, I talked about the way in which Aristotle was appropriated by Christianity, in particular Aristotle's moral framework of the mean and habit with regard to virtue, and how we got the seven deadly sins from that. Another thing you might be familiar with that's in Aristotle, at least in part, it's also in Plato and in Greek philosophy in general, and was appropriated by Christianity, is this idea of the four cardinal virtues. The four cardinal virtues. And you'll notice them in your text. Those virtues are temperance, that is regulation of our desire for physical pleasure. Temperance, courage, we've already talked about that a little bit. Being courageous, regulating our fear, our emotion of fear between an excess and a deficiency. Wisdom, or in particular practical wisdom or prudence. And then finally justice. Which means something like being objective and fair and equitable, okay? And these four cardinal virtues take up at least several of them. Aristotle take up actually all of them take up most of the book. Book 6 is devoted entirely to practical wisdom, or phronesis, or prudence. Book 5 is devoted entirely to justice. And the end of books 3 and some of 4 are devoted to temperance and courage. And just let me say a little bit about these four cardinal virtues. These four cardinal virtues for the Greeks, and for Aristotle, therefore, are the reason they're called cardinal is cardinal means hinge. They're the four hinge virtues. They're the condition for the possibility of happiness. If you have these four habits in your soul, you'll be happy. Happy people look like this. They have these four virtues, okay? And this is kind of the idea. These four virtues, then, are kind of the ideal of what it means to be a human being for the Greeks. Temperance, courage, prudence, and justice. Okay? Let me just go through and say a little bit about these. Temperance is the moderation of physical desire. That is our desire for physical pleasure. You have an excess of that. You're a glutton of some kind, I guess. Aristotle actually says if you don't desire enough physical pleasure, you're just weird. He doesn't met many people who don't like physical pleasure. Most of us are striving to control our physical appetites. And temperance is the moderation of that. A temperate person, or a patient person even, is someone who can control their appetites. It's hitting the middle between this excess and deficiency. And the interesting thing about temperance, and it's of course relevant to the college life, is it concerns really sexual desire and alcohol, really partying, really having a good time is what temperance kind of reigns in. And Aristotle says very simply, the more you give in to physical pleasure, the more you give in to partying, the more you give in to too much of this, an excess of it, the more you'll begin to lose your rationality, the more you lose your perspective when you give in to excess. Whether it's, it doesn't have to simply be physical pleasure. It could be anger. It could be anything that you go into in excess. You begin to lose your rationality. If you give too much into fear, you become irrational. So what the virtue of temperance does, the cardinal virtue, is preserves rationality. Recall the human being as a teleological creature who has their aim and they're goal-oriented. And if you're a thoughtful, virtuous person, or trying to live the virtuous life or the good life, you're aimed at something. But if you give in to pleasure, or to an excess of emotion, I should say, in any form, you're going to lose your vision. And what temperance does is preserves your vision. It preserves the vision of the end. Okay? It enables you to see clearly. Okay? Because when you're too much thinking about physical pleasure, or you're too angry, or too fearful, you cannot see clearly. We say this all the time to each other. You're not thinking clearly. You're upset, or you're angry. Just calm down and think clearly, because emotion can overwhelm reason for Aristotle. And so he thinks the virtue of temperance preserves our rationality. It also, one final thing, is it preserves our sense of time. When you're in excess of physical pleasure, you're very angry, you're very fearful, you're only in the present moment. And contrary to sort of pop wisdom or conventional wisdom, living in the present moment is not a good thing for Aristotle. Human beings want to be future-oriented. We want to be goal seekers. Living in the present moment means you have no goals. It reminds me of something I heard recently, that when people say, where do you see yourself in 20 years? And people say, well, I see myself on a beach relaxing with a margarita. And you think, well, you can only do that for about a week or maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month before you're sick of it and before you actually have to start living life again and setting goals. And Aristotle would say the same thing. This idea of just relaxing all the time and living in the present moment, while fun and enjoyable in the short term, is no long-term solution for happiness for Aristotle. And so the cardinal virtue of temperance can preserve not only rationality but our sense of time. It makes us aware that we have our future ahead of us and that we still have to make a self here. We still have to form a human being. Remember I put this existentially and said that we're the only being that has its being to be. Our being is a task for us. Our self is something we have control over. And when you're lacking temperance, you're not thinking correctly about time. You're in the present moment, indulging in fleeting ephemeral pleasures, and not thinking about what you're doing with your existence. And an obvious example of this again would be how your studies start to go down if you start partying too much. It's kind of obvious, but Aristotle thinks it's good and best to keep in mind the necessity of the cardinal virtue of temperance, which is moderating desire, in particular physical desire, but any emotion. So one could say that all virtue, in a certain sense, has the virtue of temperance.